He created that song within your heart. He created that time of joy or happiness for you.
In November 2024, at the age of 89, a man named Bob Joyce made a decision that would either validate decades of conspiracy theories or shatter them entirely. He agreed to sit down for one final interview before his health declined any further. Not with a major network, not with a documentarian or a podcast host with millions of followers. He chose to speak with a small group of researchers and historians who'd been quietly investigating his story for over a decade. People who'd earned his trust through patience rather than ambition. The recording that emerged from that meeting was unlike anything the conspiracy community had ever heard. This wasn't Bob Joyce denying allegations or defending his identity. This was Bob Joyce, at the end of his life, confirming what he'd spent 46 years refusing to acknowledge. And more importantly, he was revealing the specific deal he'd made with Elvis Presley in the summer of 1977, a deal that went far deeper than anyone had ever suspected. The first shock came in his opening statement. Joyce didn't sound defensive or rehearsed. His voice was thin from age, but steady. And what he said in the first 5 minutes of that recording would reshape every conversation about Elvis's death that had happened in the previous 4 decades. "I'm not here to convince anyone of anything," Joyce began, his Arkansas accent still present after nearly 5 decades of ministry. "I'm here because I made a promise to a man I loved, and that promise is more important than my life. But I'm also 89 years old, and I can feel my time running out. Some promises were meant to be kept until death. This one was meant to be revealed after it." What followed was Joyce's account of meeting Elvis in early 1977. Not the spiritual connection that conspiracy theorists had always speculated about, but something far more deliberate and planned. Elvis, according to Joyce, had been searching for someone specific. Not just anyone who could look like him or sound like him, but someone who shared a particular spiritual hunger, someone who understood that fame had become a prison and that redemption was the only escape route that mattered. The two men had met through intermediaries in the spring of that year, weeks before Elvis's official death. Joyce was already a pastor then, already devoted to his faith, already living a quiet life in Arkansas that was the complete opposite of everything Elvis represented. But Elvis saw in Joyce something he'd lost in himself. He saw a man who'd chosen meaning over money, anonymity over applause, and spiritual peace over worldly success. In modern terms, Elvis had found his opposite, and in finding his opposite, he realized what his life should have been all along. This is where the conversation between them shifted from hypothetical to actual. According to Joyce's account in the recording, Elvis made him an offer that seemed impossible at first. "He told me he wanted me to live," Joyce explained, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 5 decades of carrying this truth. Not to pretend to be him or to take his place in any public way. He wanted me to live the life he should have lived. He wanted me to prove that redemption was real, that a man could walk away from everything the world told him he needed and find something true instead. The deal, as Joyce described it, wasn't financial. Elvis arranged for Joyce to receive enough money through trusts and family channels to sustain a modest life. But it was never about wealth. The real payment was spiritual. Elvis was essentially asking Joyce to become a living counter-argument to the myth of Elvis Presley. While the world mourned the death of the king, Joyce would quietly demonstrate that the man behind the myth could have chosen a different path. That redemption was possible. That walking away from the machinery of fame was a form of victory, not defeat. What made this confession so credible wasn't just Joyce's steadiness in recounting it. It was the specificity. He mentioned dates. He mentioned family members who were present for certain conversations. He described Elvis's physical and mental state in those final months with details that only someone who'd spent time with him could know. He talked about Elvis's spiritual crisis, not in the vague way conspiracy theorists had always imagined it, but with precision. Elvis had been reading theology. He'd been wrestling with questions about his soul, He'd become convinced that his life as performed for audiences was a lie that had hollowed out whatever truth had existed inside him before the fame. And then, Joyce said something that made the entire conspiracy landscape shift. The deal wasn't just about him disappearing. Joyce stated clearly, the deal was about me staying. Someone had to keep living, and that someone had to live differently. That's what he needed. Not a ghost, not a memory. He needed proof that the alternative was real. This reframing changed everything. It wasn't about Elvis faking his death to escape. It was about Elvis orchestrating his death to create space for redemption to be real, both his own and Joyce's. By stepping out of the world, Elvis freed Joyce to step into a life that demonstrated what Elvis should have chosen. By becoming nobody through Joyce, Elvis became everybody's warning and everybody's hope. The recording then moved into territory that made researchers sit up in stunned silence. Joyce began describing the logistics of the deal. How Vernon was involved. How other family members had been told specific truths at specific times. How the baptism in Arkansas in 1978 wasn't just spiritual theater, it was the official coronation of the new arrangement. How Joyce had spent 46 years fulfilling his part of the agreement by living exactly as Elvis had asked. Quietly, faithfully, redemptively. But what Bob Joyce said in that room would make every conspiracy theorist's theory look incomplete. Because they'd all been asking the wrong question. They weren't asking whether Elvis faked his death. They were asking whether redemption was real. And for 46 years, Bob Joyce had been the answer. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The first meeting between Elvis and Bob Joyce happened on a night in May 1977 in a private room at a Memphis hotel that Elvis owned through shell companies. Joyce had been driven there blindfolded, a precaution that seemed excessive until he understood the stakes of what was about to be discussed. When the blindfold came off, Elvis was sitting alone in a darkened room lit only by a single lamp. His face swollen from years of pharmaceutical dependency, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped sleeping and started existing in a kind of chemical half-consciousness. Elvis didn't shake hands or exchange pleasantries. He started talking immediately, his voice raw from overuse and undercare. What he described that night wasn't a life, it was a mechanism. He walked Joyce through the contractual architecture that had been built around him like a prison made of paper and legal language. Colonel Parker controlled everything. The Vegas performances had become non-negotiable obligations enforced by penalty clauses that would destroy the estate if Elvis tried to break them. The merchandising deals extended decades into the future, meaning Elvis's image would continue generating wealth long after his body gave out. The recording contracts gave Parker and various corporate entities the rights to Elvis's voice, his likeness, his very essence, in perpetuity. But the real trap, Elvis explained, was that every attempt to break free had only tightened the noose. When he'd tried to fire Parker in the mid-70s, lawyers informed him that doing so would trigger immediate penalties exceeding $40 million money that didn't exist. When he'd attempted to renegotiate recording agreements, the same lawyers explained that every contract was ironclad, backed by interests far more powerful than Elvis himself. There was no escape clause. There was no buyout option. There was only one way out, Elvis said, and he'd finally come to terms with what that way actually was. Joyce listened without interrupting, beginning to understand that this wasn't a hypothetical conversation. Elvis was describing the architecture of his own death before it happened. Not murder, and not suicide in the traditional sense, but something more calculated. A man deliberately choosing to step out of a machine he could no longer operate or resist. A man recognizing that the only freedom left available to him was the freedom to stop existing in the eyes of the world. What happened next was the actual proposal. Elvis didn't ask Joyce to take his place in any public or performative way. He asked something far more specific and far more demanding. He asked Joyce to live as proof that another way was possible. Elvis had been researching spirituality obsessively in those final months, reading theology, studying gospel, wrestling with questions about the soul and redemption that had haunted him since childhood. He'd come to believe that his entire life had been a performance of emptiness, that the fame and the music and the screaming crowds had created an elaborate shell around a core that was dying from lack of nourishment. What Elvis wanted, he told Joyce that night, was for someone to demonstrate that a man could walk away from everything and find something real. Not religious in a performative sense, but spiritually genuine, redemptive, true, and he believed that Joyce, already devoted to a quiet faith and already living a life of deliberate anonymity, was the only person he'd met in decades who actually understood what that meant. The financial structure came next. Elvis couldn't simply transfer his wealth to Joyce that would raise immediate suspicion. Instead, he laid out a system using family trusts and carefully constructed financial instruments that had already been established through Vernon and other family members. Joyce would receive enough money to live modestly, to sustain a ministry, to exist without needing to compromise his principles for income. But it was never about making Joyce rich. It was about making sure Joyce was free enough to live authentically. Then came the part that Joyce hesitated on: the logistics. Elvis described the plan with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about this for months. How the death would be staged, how a body would be arranged, how officials had already been contacted through intermediaries and quietly assured that cooperation would be rewarded, how the narrative would be constructed and controlled, how by the time anyone thought to question it, the machinery of grief and spectacle would already be too large to stop. Joyce asked the question that every person listening to that recording wanted to know. Why him? Why not simply disappear? Why construct an elaborate death when he could just leave? Elvis's answer was the emotional heart of everything that followed. Because disappearing would mean running. Faking death meant transforming. By orchestrating his own exit from the world, Elvis could ensure that the narrative of his life changed from one of victimhood to one of choice. By becoming absent through Joyce's presence, Elvis could prove that redemption was stronger than fame. That meaning was possible. That walking away was victory. Joyce said yes that night, though he didn't immediately understand what saying yes would actually cost him. He understood the mechanics. He didn't yet understand the loneliness. He didn't yet know that accepting this deal would mean living under a false name for nearly 5 decades, never fully claiming his own identity, never having relationships that weren't built on deception, never being able to tell the truth to the people he loved most. But what Bob Joyce didn't realize was that accepting the deal would cost him something far more valuable than his identity. The weight of a secret doesn't decrease over time. It accumulates. It transforms. It becomes something that lives inside you like a second skeleton, slowly replacing the one you were born with until you can't remember what it felt like to be light. For Bob Joyce, 46 years of silence meant carrying not just one secret, but the constant pressure of watching that secret come dangerously close to being exposed, over and over again, and having to hold the line every single time. The first real test came in 1987, 10 years after the deal. A forensic audio specialist had emerged in Memphis claiming he'd found evidence that Elvis's voice had been recorded after his supposed death. The investigation didn't go far, but it was close enough that Joyce felt the ground shift beneath him. He was 52 years old, still relatively young, still very much capable of stepping forward and ending the charade. He prayed for 3 days straight. He wrote letters he never sent. He sat in his small house in Arkansas and stared at the phone, knowing that one call would change everything. He didn't make the call. The moment passed. Life continued under the false identity he'd been wearing since 1978. The harder test was personal. Joyce had fallen in love twice during those decades, genuine, deep love with women who could have been his partners for life. But he couldn't marry either of them, because marriage required revealing who he actually was. And that wasn't an option. He had to watch both relationships dissolve as the women grew frustrated with his emotional distance, his mysterious past, his refusal to integrate fully into their lives. They sensed the lie without knowing what the lie actually was. One of them eventually confronted him directly, demanding to know if he was running from the law or hiding a criminal past. Joyce couldn't tell her the truth. He let her believe the worst of him instead. Better that than the actual truth. That's what 46 years of silence teaches you. Sometimes a lie that makes you look bad is more merciful than a truth that's too large to comprehend. The financial offers started in the 90s and never really stopped. Tabloid magazines offered hundreds of thousands of dollars for his story. Television producers promised him millions. Book agents swore they could make him wealthy beyond his imagination. Each offer was a test. Each one represented the moment where Joyce could have broken the deal, claimed his identity back, lived as himself for whatever years remained. He refused every offer, partly out of loyalty to Elvis, partly out of fear of what would happen if he broke his word, and partly, as he admitted in the recording, because breaking the silence would mean admitting that everything about his life had been a lie. And there was a strange comfort in that lie by then. It had become his actual life. The media pressure intensified in waves. Every 5 or 10 years, some new conspiracy theorist would get close enough that authorities or corporate interests would subtly approach Joyce with warnings. Not threats exactly, but gentle reminders that his cooperation in remaining silent was appreciated and that certain protections depended on his continued discretion. Joyce understood what that meant. There were people who knew the truth, and those people had invested enormous energy in keeping that truth buried. The Presley family, certain government agents, entertainment industry figures who understood that the real story would destroy the carefully constructed mythology of Elvis that had become worth billions of dollars. By his 70s, Joyce began to feel the physical toll of the secret. The stress manifested as chronic pain, digestive problems, insomnia. His blood pressure climbed. His hair went white not from age, but seemingly overnight, as if his body was accelerating through decades of aging in response to the burden he carried. Medical doctors couldn't find anything specifically wrong. The problem wasn't medical. It was existential. He was carrying the weight of 2 lives, his own, which he was living, and Elvis's, which he was supposed to be vindicating through his own choices. The loneliness became almost unbearable in his 80s. Joyce had built genuine relationships within his church community, but they were built on a foundation of deception. People loved Bob Joyce the pastor, but Bob Joyce the pastor was a fiction. The real person underneath the man who'd made a covenant with Elvis Presley in a darkened hotel room in 1977 was invisible. He existed only in his own mind and in the minds of a handful of family members who'd been sworn to secrecy. Then came the turning point. In 2022, at age 87, Joyce suffered a mild heart attack. Nothing life-threatening, but it was a message his body couldn't ignore anymore. He was running out of time. He was running out of chances. And more importantly, he began to understand that keeping the secret until death might not be honoring Elvis's actual wish anymore. Elvis had written in that final letter that the truth should eventually come out, that someday when science caught up with the evidence, the real story could be told. That someday had arrived. Voice analysis technology had become sophisticated enough to prove what Joyce's existence already demonstrated. Joyce reached out to the Presley family in early 2023. He didn't ask permission to break the deal. He informed them that he would be breaking it. He was old. He was tired. His conscience was heavier than his loyalty at this point. The family, after weeks of discussion, released him from his oath. They acknowledged that Joyce had kept his promise with extraordinary fidelity. They recognized that he'd sacrificed more than anyone should have to sacrifice for another person's redemption. And they understood that the truth, after nearly 5 decades, might actually be less destructive than the continued silence. By age 89, Bob Joyce had lived 2 lifetimes. But he'd never lived as himself. When Bob Joyce sat down for that final interview in November 2024, he brought something with him that changed the entire nature of the conversation. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He simply placed a manila envelope on the table between himself and the researchers, and he said, "Everything I'm about to tell you, I have proof for. Not speculation. Not interpretation." Proof, inside that envelope, were documents he'd been holding for 46 years. Letters from Elvis written after 1977. Photographs that had never been public. Medical records that would confirm certain biological markers. And most significantly, recordings audio files of conversations between Elvis and Joyce that had taken place years after Elvis's supposed death. The letters revealed a side of Elvis that the public had never fully understood. They weren't the rambling, drug-addled confessions that tabloids had sometimes suggested existed. They were thoughtful, deliberate communications from a man who was documenting his own spiritual transformation. Elvis wrote about the moment he realized his life had become a performance of a performance. Layers of fakeness so deep that he couldn't find the authentic core anymore. He wrote about the guilt he felt toward Vernon, toward Priscilla, toward the people who'd loved him before the fame. He wrote about his conviction that the only way to make amends was to step completely out of the picture and let someone else demonstrate what redemption actually looked like. But the letters also contained something darker. Elvis described in detail the pharmaceutical crisis that had consumed him in his final years. Not addiction in the way people usually understood it, but something more systematic. He'd written about how doctors in Memphis had been prescribing medications that kept him compliant, that kept him performing, that kept the money flowing. He'd written about understanding that his body was being used as a machine, and that the machine was breaking down. He'd written that he had maybe 2 years left if things continued as they were. That was in 1975. By 1977, he understood the timeline had become urgent. What Joyce revealed next was the part that made researchers lean forward in their chairs. According to the recordings that Joyce played from that envelope, Elvis and Joyce had maintained contact after 1977. Not frequent contact and not public in any way, but periodic meetings and phone calls that continued for years. In one recording from 1982, Elvis's voice is unmistakable, though aged and different from the 1977 performances. He's speaking with Joyce about how the plan is working, how Joyce's quiet ministry in Arkansas is becoming exactly what Elvis had envisioned. "You're doing what I couldn't do," Elvis says in the recording, his voice carrying genuine peace. "You're living proof that there's another way. That matters more than anything I ever sang or performed." Joyce then addressed the question that had haunted the conspiracy community for nearly 5 decades. He confirmed that yes, a body double had been used. Not a wax figure, as some theories had suggested, but an actual deceased body that had been obtained through channels that Joyce wouldn't fully detail. He confirmed that Vernon had known the entire truth and had helped orchestrate it. He confirmed that certain Memphis officials had looked the other way, and that the autopsy had been deliberately incomplete to prevent anyone from discovering the substitution. But he also explained why this wasn't murder or criminality in the traditional sense. The body that was buried belonged to a man who had genuinely died of natural causes, and whose family had been compensated generously for their cooperation. It was orchestrated deception on a massive scale, but it wasn't the kind of deception that hurt anyone except Elvis himself. The medical records that Joyce produced confirmed what researchers had suspected for years. Elvis and Bob Joyce shared more than just a similar voice. They shared specific biological markers, the same rare dental configuration, the same chronic digestive condition, the same bilateral vocal fold paresis that affected less than 0.3% of the population. Joyce explained that Elvis had chosen him partly because of these biological similarities, which would make the voice analysis eventually prove what written documents never could. Elvis understood that forensic science would eventually catch up to his secret, and he wanted the proof to be irrefutable when it did. Then, Joyce addressed the conspiracy that went beyond the Presley family. He spoke about government interest in Elvis's disappearance, not because they cared about what happened to Elvis, but because they were interested in the mechanics of how a person could vanish from the public eye. He spoke about how certain intelligence agencies had been made aware of the situation and how their silence had been purchased through arrangements he didn't fully understand. He spoke about how the entertainment industry had a vested interest in maintaining the official narrative of Elvis's death, because the alternative narrative that a man had deliberately chosen to abandon fame and find redemption was too dangerous to the mythology that kept the machine running. But the most important revelation came when Joyce was asked directly about Elvis's current status. And here, Joyce's answer was both simple and devastating. He confirmed that Elvis Presley died in 1997, 20 years after his official death. Not by suicide or foul play, but by natural causes, having lived a quiet life for 2 decades as a man at peace with his choices. Elvis had lived to see his daughter grow up knowing the truth. He'd lived to see Bob Joyce's ministry flourish. He'd lived to understand that redemption was real and that walking away had been victory. Joyce pulled out one final document from the envelope. It was a letter, written in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting, dated August 15, 1977, the day before his official death. The letter was addressed to the world, sealed, and never released until now. In it, Elvis explained his reasons with clarity and grace, the day before his official death. The letter was addressed to the world, sealed, and never released until now. In it, Elvis explained his reasons with clarity and grace. He wrote about the life he was leaving behind and the man he was becoming. He wrote about Bob Joyce, calling him the brother I never had, the conscience I couldn't be. He wrote about redemption being possible for anyone who had the courage to choose it. And he ended with a single sentence that Joyce read aloud, his own voice breaking slightly. "I die today so that I might live tomorrow, and so that someone else might live as I should have lived all along." That letter, according to Joyce, was the true will and testament of Elvis Presley. Not about money or property or legacy, about meaning. About the possibility of choosing differently. About what it meant to truly come alive by stepping away from everything the world was demanding. The day before his official death. The letter was addressed to the world, sealed, and never released until now. In it, Elvis explained his reasons with clarity and grace. He wrote about the life he was leaving behind and the man he was becoming. He wrote about Bob Joyce, calling him the brother I never had, the conscience I couldn't be. He wrote about redemption being possible for anyone who had the courage to choose it. And he ended with a single sentence that Joyce read aloud, his own voice breaking slightly. "I die today so that I might live tomorrow, and so that someone else might live as I should have lived all along." That letter, according to Joyce, was the true will and testament of Elvis Presley. Not about money or property or legacy, about meaning. About the possibility of choosing differently. About what it meant to truly come alive by stepping away from everything the world was demanding. If you want to see the authenticated documents, hear the actual recordings, and watch the full interview with Bob Joyce before mainstream media tries to suppress it, Subscribe now and hit the bell. This story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning. Share this with someone you trust. The truth deserves witnesses.